In this episode, I am joined by Jason Miller, occultist, author, and teacher. Jason discusses how to judge authenticity in the occult, considers the different levels of magical practitioner alive in the world today, and whether it is more efficacious to curse your enemies or pray for them. Jason reveals the origin and unfolding of his passion for the occult, considers the role of talent in successful spellcasting, and recounts his astral awakening. Jason also shares the art of protection magic, gives his advice on occult protection for political candidates, and explains the steps he would take to extend magical protection if hired to do so. So without further ado, Jason Miller. Jason Miller, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so delighted to talk with you here on the podcast. And I hope that today we can focus on your life and your path, a path that's actually seen you intersect with several of previous guests on this podcast.
Yeah, quite a few. It's been an eclectic, weird journey, but that's the world we live in now, right?
Yes, I've heard you say that you think it's one of the gifts of the age, actually, this ability to taste and sample and contact many different traditions. Some people see that as a bad thing. They say, well, it encourages dilettantism. But you have a slightly different view.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that view. I think it does encourage dilettantism. I think you don't get an upside without a downside. It's just the way things are. And so I definitely see the negative impact of dilettantism, of people running to the new and shiny. But at the same time, it offers its own interesting perspective. You're no longer locked into one thing, or if you are, you've decided upon that, right? So I think in this day and age, people come to a place where they have to make a decision, whereas in the past, that decision would have been made for you. You were born into this culture, and maybe you're intersecting a little bit, or maybe you go travel widely. But for the most part, your spirituality, your practices are going to be filtered through that lens, right? If Meister Eckhart wasn't born in Germany, if he was born in India, he would have still been Meister Eckhart. He would have still had that non-dualistic view, but it definitely would not have been through a Christian lens. Whereas nowadays, it's impossible not to interface with people. I mean, I was born in sort of rural, like the beginning of the rural part of New Jersey, right? Nowhere special. And before the age of 21, I had intersected with an African-American root worker, a couple centeros, a Rosicrucian teacher, and a Ngakpa, John Reynolds. So how am I, at that point, you're interested in magic or spirituality. What does that mean? Does that mean that you say, okay, well, I've got to pick one of these forever? Or do I look at this as like it's a real thing and I'm going to see what's out there? And then I think that's where the difference between the dilettantes and serious people come in. Serious people will buckle down to one and become adept at it, competent, if not mastery. And you can only do that with a few things in life, right? You can't do that with every book that you read, suddenly go off and master it. But you can do it with a few things. So that's that's sort of what's out there.
You have had, you mentioned there, early in contact with practitioners, and that's something that you've been fortunate enough to continue throughout your life. You've made contact with all sorts of interesting people. I'm curious, before we get into the specifics of your biography, I don't know quite, I'm going to frame this wrong and then you can correct me, but how many legitimate practitioners are there out there? You say, well, I met a root worker, and then I met, this person's, Western magic, this one's that, the other. Of course, a lot of people might identify themselves as such. They even perhaps teach classes or, have a local group. I suppose you could say they're practitioners. They're practicing something. But is there a threshold beyond which someone passes where they become more than just a sort of participant in a system like that, and they become, I don't know, holders of it in some sense, or they have some sort of, would it be the right word, power that they can wield via that system? I don't mean over others in terms of a hierarchical sense, but I mean perhaps in a magical sense.
Right. Well, this, you've had a lot of tantrikas on, so I'm going to put it in those terms. In tantra, you've got generation stage and completion stage, right? Attached to your generation stage sadhanas and your practices, where you're visualizing yourself as a deity and you're saying this mantra and you're sort of on this journey, but for a lot of people, it's ritual. You're a ritualist. You're visualizing, you're saying, and then of course there's those action mantras, spells, essentially, right? And you've got thread crosses that you can make, and you've got amulets that you can make, and all these kinds of things. They're all attached to the generation stage. One doesn't necessarily need to be a master of the internal yogas in order to do those things and have them be effective, right? So to that extent, I think there's a lot of people who can do magic to one extent or another. Then there are people who go deeper, and they are doing those completion stage. They are not just doing things that create magic, but they are changed thereby, right? I think there's less of those, for sure. And then we get into, if we frame it as legitimacy or not, then we have a problem of judging the authenticity. And I think that gets tricky. And I think people need to separate what they mean by that. So I often will talk to people and say, well, hold on. Are we talking about historical, like authenticity, in which case usually whatever oldest is best, right? Well, this is the older way, so therefore it's better, and everything else that came afterwards is crap, right? Like if it's from India, it's great, and if it's a terma, it's crap, unless you're Enigma, in which case if it's terma, it's great, and if it's kama, it's crap. But I mean, it's not crap, but then we have cultural authenticity, right? So things don't necessarily need to be old, but we need to know that this is what is done in this culture, right? And that it's widespread. So things like, for instance, the Santa Muerte practices, they're fairly new as far as how widespread the practices are, and most of what's being done now, I think, is fairly new, but it's certainly authentic culturally. Then you've just got pure function. It works, ergo it's authentic. Doesn't matter if somebody had a vision and just pulled it, what some people will just say, well, yeah, they said they had a vision, but really they just yanked it out of their butt. But if it works, then great. And then I suppose you have just pure meaning and poetic, right? It may not do anything functionally. It may not be old. It may not be culturally relevant, but yet it holds some kind of meaning for people. I think all of these are ways to view authenticity. And Lord knows, I've met some Western practitioners who are extremely dedicated to their practices. And, I don't even know that anyone would know who they are, because they go and they get the teachings, and then they go home and they practice those teachings. They're not necessarily at the Dharma Center or traveling or doing much in the community at large. And then I've met people that are, recognized tulkus, ethnically Tibetan, that I would say that person is fraudulent and in every way that matters to me, right? And a bad actor. So who's to say? There's obviously not everything everyone claims is to be believed, and the proof is in the pudding. And I try not to present myself by putting out too many like, I've done this and that and I can do, I try to keep it as real as possible. Under promise, over deliver.
It's a good strategy, yes. Given that there are these different centers of authenticity, if we could put it that way, well, it's historically authentic, or it has authentic in a meaning sense. It may not be historically accurate, but it has a lot of meaning. Or maybe it mixes those things, or it has less of those other, but it's very functional. Who cares about the other? And so there's these different aspects. One thing that I think can happen with that is that it's very easy to slip from one center of authenticity to the other, almost without realizing it, whenever one is pressed. So show me the goods. Yeah, but it's mostly about meaning. It's about, you're too superficial. Think about the meaning. And then it comes out, so it's just all about meaning. It's arbitrary. It says, no, because it has historical precedent. Oh, okay, It has historical precedent, but does it work? Well, the thing is, it's about meaning. So there could be this sort of slip that can happen. I know you're very practically oriented, but you have an appreciation also for the historical, and you have an appreciation also for the meaning and the aesthetic and so on. How can you, in a sense, hold one's own centers of authenticity to account in one's practice? Have I framed that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it really has to do with paying attention to claims that are made, even to yourself, and then kind of holding others or yourself to that, So I've met people, oh, yes, I was authorized to teach. And then you ask those people or the people who knew those people, and they're like, no. And then you go back and say, well, I can teach because of some other reason. And it's like, well, that may be true, but you said this, right? You said this is where it comes from. So, or, if you are doing a practice and you're not getting anything out of it, right? If you're getting into it and you're like, I want this to change my life for the better in X ways. I want to be happier, wiser, more confident, or just practical magic ways. I want to be, wealthier, more stable person, et cetera, et cetera. And then you give it a good while. I'm not talking about people that jump in and then they're like, oh, my life didn't, I went on a retreat and my life didn't instantly change. This is BS. But, people who honestly give it a shot and practice diligently and then step away and say, for whatever reason, this isn't for me. There's a temptation there, even with ourselves, to kind of say, well, all right, it didn't deliver those goods, but it's still fulfilling this need, or it's still legitimate because of this. And sometimes that's okay, because our needs, we've learned something else. We've learned to reframe what we needed. But then sometimes it really is just sunk costs fallacy, right? Like, I've got all this crap that I bought, and I've spent 3 years doing this practice with this teacher. So I'm good or bad, I'm in now, but really, maybe look elsewhere.
It's an interesting line of inquiry. I think something else that can happen, particularly in religious systems, is the context can be redrawn to such vast timelines and such epic vistas that suddenly the idea of any detectable result or feedback becomes irrelevant. For example, when one places oneself in the continuity of lives going back and forth and elevates, say, bodhisattvas and other beings to such greater levels of realization and accomplishment than us over a great number of lifetimes, etc., etc. Suddenly, the idea that it's going to, quote unquote, work for you, despite all the assurances, I think can seem a little remote and kind of irrelevant. That one ought to park oneself for the long haul, so to speak. And the long haul not being sort of 3 or 4 years of dedicated practice, but maybe 3 or 4 eons.
Yes. And so if that kind of faith moves you, like, if you can stick to a practice and say, I have faith that over the course of several lifetimes, this is going to matter, then okay, great. I've never had that kind of faith. I've never had that kind of faith. I've you know, I've even encountered, I've been in situations in groups where when someone does get a result, they kind of get told, like, why are you even claiming this result? What are you, some great Mahasiddha or something? You know, come on. And yet, so we uphold these bodhisattvas as special and unattainable. And I think, God, I haven't been involved in the Dharma community for a while, but I think it was Milarepa who once chided his students because his students were like, come on, who were you? You must have been some really important Mahasiddha to become Milarepa. And Milarepa is like, no, you're showing lack of faith that this will work in one lifetime, that you can attain this by suggesting that if I have attained it, I must be somehow special. So I kind of fall back to that, like, things work or they don't work. And a lifetime is, we unfortunately have these breaks in consciousness between lives, right? I think about how different my day would be if I were to have chamomile tea in the morning instead of coffee. And like the difference in consciousness, well, just imagine the difference in consciousness between having a completely different brain, like, never mind the chemicals in it, like a completely different brain. And so even between incarnations, there are very few tulkus that I think are legit that will talk about previous lives as if they remember them super clearly, right? So for me, I want to see some kind of benefit this life, not today, not immediately, but this life. And I can look around at practices that I've been given, that I have engaged with and worked with, and can look at and say, yeah, this was was definitely worth it. And I can look at some practices that I've received in vision, or what critics would say I pulled out of my butt, and am equally like, yes, this is work. And I also have a few that are like, yeah, this wasn't for me. It might be well for others. This wasn't for me. And some of them are really surprising. Some of them might be some new age thing that I look at and I'm like, that's utter crap. But, this person swears by it, so I'll give it a shot. And then I find some worth in it. You never can tell. Everything was new at one point.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What is it that keeps or has kept you going with such a passion and such a dedication? Now I think we're edging slightly closer to your actual life story, and in that case I'd like to start from the beginning. But I wonder if it's possible, even before that, to comment on what's kept you going.
Yeah. So, what has kept me going is, I forget which theologian talked about a God-shaped hole that the mystics seek to fill. I don't know if I have a God-shaped hole in my heart, but I have a magic-shaped hole in my head. And I always have, since I had some experiences when I was young, in just involuntary experiences that felt more real than reality, and they stuck with me. And then in my teens, when I started to discover mysticism and occultism and magic and whatnot, I knew pretty instantly that, like, I found this thing that called to me, and it called to me in a way nothing else did. And I could read books that were way beyond my years and understand them reasonably well, and have no trouble finding people to correct my misunderstandings, which was, I came to find out was, a difficulty for a lot of people. But I found things just fell into place for me really remarkably easily. And as life becomes more serious, right? You get out of school, and it's sort of like, I have to make a life. And this was before the era of the internet and, teaching magic and Buddhism and everything else online being more or less commonplace. So there were a lot of times where I was like, I should really set this down, because the study and practice of magic, occultism, spirituality takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And we only have so much time and effort and attention in any given day. And my career is suffering, such as it is. I couldn't even call it a career at the time. The job I held at the time, would suffer. I wasn't putting my energy into making money. I put my energy into finding a partner, and maybe at times she would say I'm not putting enough energy into the relationship, but I tried. And then when kids came along, there too, it becomes even scarier, because now you're responsible for these people. So there were a lot of times when maybe I should have like set it aside, but it's hard to say. I couldn't. Even things that were disappointing, I had to, I had to just keep going. And eventually, it was after kids, actually. That was the point where I was sort of like, well, I can either really put all this down get a straight corporate job, maybe go back to school for something, and find myself at 50 saying, well, I would have done this except for you kids. Or I can make a go of this as a career and say, yeah, I was able to do this because of you kids. So I chose the latter and it worked out. So, part of it now is just, it's my job. So, even if I have moments of disappointment or crises of faith, I still have that magic shaped hole in my mind. I still want to just keep learning new things from people, but it's also my job. So the reality is, too late to turn back now. But I'm 51, so I'm good.
Has the professionalizing of your practice, how has that impacted your personal practice? Are you still able to do a personal practice that's not somehow related, even as perhaps in a sort of research and development way, to a future offering or sharing? Or is your practice now part of the, I suppose, professional real estate, ripe for sharing with your students and so on? And I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just curious about that. Is there still an intimate dimension to your practice? Has that remained there, or is it all given over to sharing through your sort of professional channels now?
The good thing about this being my career and not having to maintain any other job is that I now have enough time to dedicate to the magic and practices that I'm teaching, so that I can actually say, yes, I'm doing this along with you. And I mean, a large portion of my week is spent answering questions. So, I can be in it with them and say, yeah, and I was recently doing this myself, and, this. And, but at the same time, I also still have time for other practices, meditations, devotions that I don't expect to ever teach. Some of them are just practices that I've learned from others that I think, they're being taught already. So I don't need to teach them. And yeah, they're private practices and devotions and things like that. So both. But I have that time. If anything impacts my practice, it's probably, kids and that kind of thing more. Constant, I want to do my sadhana, but the kids need to be driven to the game and picked up from skiing. So,
and how do you handle that sort of a conflict then?
The kids first. I'm when it comes down to it, I'm a pretty boring person when it comes to the ins and outs of life. Married, kids, I try to be a good dad. For me, that's part of my practice, as far as the life practice, like that's what I've committed to, and find joy in. So once the kids were born, I knew I would not be running off to Nepal or, backpacking through Europe anymore, because I mean, people still do it with kids, but I've never kind of looked at that and been like, yeah, I want to take my kids over there to do that. It's never appealed to me. So yeah. So the kids always come first when that comes down to it. I can always stay up later.
Yeah. And there's also that line, isn't there, between practice and application, if we take the word practice slightly differently. Sometimes there's opportunities, I think myself anyway, I sometimes see those opportunities, those commitments that impinge on one's personal religious routine, sometimes it's like, oh, here's actually an opportunity to apply the themes of practice. Oddly enough, not to denigrate practice as simply a rehearsal for driving someone somewhere, but to an errand or something. Not quite that. But there's still something about the tangibility of application, especially in relationship to others.
I think it's vital. I think one of the things that is lacking from mindfulness practices and meditation practices and a lot of spiritual practices that are being offered to, you know, the populace at large, right, is the context that they're in. So, yeah, you can meditate, but unless it reflects in your life in some way, and unless you can kind of hold a view and hold virtues that make sense for you, not to be a monk. I think there are a lot of practices that work well if you're a full-time contemplative, that don't necessarily work well if you're not. And so just like kind of making a lesser version of those isn't necessarily the answer for working people. Different practices or practices couched in a different context or broken up differently might work better. So it's something to look at. I know I live not far from one of the big Shambala centers where they do a 30-day silent retreat here. And I've never been, but I see the ads, and the ads are always, you know, the faces before and the faces after. And the faces before, they're not cranky, but they're just normal. And then the faces after, there's just these beatific smiles, right? And I'm like, I want the 2 weeks after the 30-day retreat face. Like after they've gone back to the wife, the kids, the job, and how did that retreat carry forward? And I can tell you, sometimes it's worse. Sometimes it's like coming off of a diet, right? Like, you know, you weigh a certain amount, you go no carb, and then you start eating carbs again, and lo and behold, you weigh more than you did before you started. So yeah, I think sometimes we need to think about how these actually get couched in lives.
Yes, the Kool-Aid come down countenance photo is what you want.
I'm not saying that they put out a disingenuous ad. Please, I'm not suggesting that they're doing something bad with that ad. You know, I think everybody shows the upside of something, and the upside is real. Just, you know, after that, you've got to have some way to, you know, integrate back into the rest of your life, right? It's not really different than Christians on Sunday. They go to church and then immediately go home and start mistreating everyone and doing exactly, you know, what they said they wouldn't do just a few hours earlier in church.
That's a good point. There are people I've interviewed people on the podcast who claim to be unable now, because they're, due to their level of attainment, unable to feel or experience negative states. And sometimes those negative states are defined as up to and including romantic attraction and so on. Of course, also anger, fear, jealousy, etc. as well. Schadenfreude, presumably. So yeah. I mean, maybe they're onto something.
Maybe. Good for them. My practice has made my mind bigger and my awareness bigger. Yep. So it largely becomes a matter of not that I don't feel anger or frustration, but that I have the ability to step back if I remember, which doesn't happen all the time. let me be clear. But I have the ability because of practice to say, okay, anger is in my mind stream, but I'm not angry. I'm experiencing anger, but I'm also experiencing everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so anger, you can be there. You can have a seat at the table, but you're not dominating the conversation. Now, in the heat of anger, depends on how bad. In the heat of sorrow and mourning and whatnot. And then there are times where I think as a practitioner, we can show emotion a little bit differently than most people. And so the danger is like, aren't you upset about this? Like, aren't you in rage, or aren't you devastated? And it's not that you're not, but you're not necessarily showing it in the same way. And so then sometimes, you might have to just kind of, yes, to make other people feel better. But that said, I am not so attained that I don't get trapped in anger or sorrow or anything else at times. So for sure, I can be irritable, and I've never met somebody who really wasn't. I lived for a time with somebody that I consider the greatest practitioner I've ever met, Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche. I lived with him for over a month. And I saw him kind of, reach states of kind of drinking. And, he would say, go get me a whiskey. And then his Jomo would say, don't. So that's the reality of it, right? I think most of the time he was absolutely a mind that is beyond anything that I think I'll achieve in this life. But yet, even there, can fall into sorrow and anger and things like this that aren't necessarily, I mean, some people would say, oh, well, no, it's crazy wisdom, it's Vajra wrath. And if I was a better Buddhist, I would think the guru is showing this, so therefore it is. But the realist in me is kind of like, dude got drunk. and that for me, if spirituality and magic and all these other things are real, then they operate a lot like other real things do. So I've never liked a lot of the kind of the mysticism and hyperbolic claims around it. But if those folks really don't experience any negative emotions, hey, good for them.
And sometimes they don't until they do.
Yes, I have actually, I remember once, I won't say who, but I remember once talking to somebody who claimed that they no longer were troubled by thoughts. And when I suggested that they weren't, they got really pissed. And they're like, I don't understand why people don't recognize my enlightenment. And I'm like, right. I can totally see Shakyamuni stomping around going, don't these people know I'm enlightened? That should be your first clue.
Very interesting. Let's pivot into your biography. You mentioned this proclivity for things magic. You had this magic-shaped hole in your brain. Where do you think that proclivity comes from?
Yeah, I can trace it. I can trace it to being on the playground maybe 4 or 5 years old. And I don't know if anything triggered it. Like, I don't know if I fell or hit my head, or, playgrounds in the 70s were not the padded wonderlands they are now. It was all sand and concrete and metal. So I might have hit my head or something. I don't know. But I remember very clearly, it's probably my most clear memory from that age. But I remember kind of looking at the ground and looking up, but almost as if all reality just stayed down there, like it was a painting, and I was looking out of it into a cosmos. And it was just very strange. It was like looking behind the curtain at a play. And I remember not really even being able to process what I was experiencing, but there were both people, but multitudes of the same person. And there were also other kinds of beings there that I sensed. And then after that, I would have these moments of visitation, for lack of a better word, where it was almost like time would stop. Like everything would suddenly go silent. If you've ever been in a room with like an air conditioner in the background and then it just shuts off, right? So it was like that. It's like the world just shuts off, and I can sense these beings behind me. I remember once like being in a car and it happened, and it seemed like there was no one in the front seat of the car. I was still a kid, so I was in the back. And these kinds of things happened, and then they slowed down and stopped when I was 6. But the memory of them really just stuck with me. And then I was in middle school, so 14 years old or so. And I think I was reading a book on tarot, but like not an instructive book. It was like a young adult novel or something. And I just became fascinated. And so I gave a friend of mine the same book, and we didn't know where to get tarot cards, and we were too young to drive. So I think we found a book, Arthur Edward Waite's Key to the Tarot, in the library. And we photocopied all the cards and cut them out. And then a teacher, Blanche Krubner, saw me with these cards and was like, would you like a real tarot deck? Like, they don't cost a lot of money. I'll just, I'll get you one. And that was sort of like, wow, this is something real that people do, And the school library and town library were almost bizarrely well stocked on occult stuff. There was this Man, Myth, and Magic encyclopedia behind me. They had a set of those, which just filled my head with like, yeah, this is real. People do this. And that's when I started to want to practice. And that's when I was devouring any books I could get my hands on and meeting people all the time. And that's how I got started. Just a weird experience that felt more real than the rest of reality, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And then I found I had, something of an aptitude for magic. So I would do simple spells from the books that I found. Nothing, but they seem to work out more often than not for small things. And that too, I was like, oh, not only is this something that you can grow by, but this is something that can reflect out into life and affect the reality around you. Like, right? Like I always think about the lamp and its rays. Like if we become illuminated is an overused phrase, but right, like if we illuminate ourselves, well, then that light should shine outward. And that to me is the magic bit, the sorcery of it. And I became absolutely fascinated, and went to everything and I could, read everything I could get my hands on, and started practicing what I read. And here I am.
What kinds of operations, magical operations, were you doing at that time? You said you were doing small spells and you noticed that they were working out more often than not. What sort of spells were you doing? What sort of effects did you notice?
Oh, like everyone else, when I decided to try a spell, I wanted to do a money spell. And then, it was about like a week after I made a talisman to find $100, which, for a 15-year-old in the 80s was quite a lot of money. And I found a wallet that had $100 in it. And I turned the wallet in, but I found $100. Other things, then I would do some things to just see if I could make names occur, right? I would see if I could get someone who was picking on me or bothering me to not bother me anymore, right? To bind someone, just leave me alone. And these things worked out very well. Not all of them, but enough of them to make me say, well, the ones that didn't work out, why? Right? Like obviously there's something to this, so why not all the time? And why not paranormal miracle things happening when sometimes I would do something and get just like an immediate response. I remember the first time I tried to conjure a spirit, Astaroth, from a book that, I would never recommend it today for anyone's first book, but we had what we had in the 80s. And I remember trying it out, and just Astaroth was behind me like a person. And then when I wanted her in front of me, the voice and presence were there, and the sight was somehow there as well. Yet not in the crystal, like at the edge of the circle instead, which was annoying. And I think that too was one of those things, like if this was a fantasy, it would not annoy the piss out of me so much, or surprise me with things it said. But then at other times, it would be far less so. But then something that I asked for would happen anyway. So maybe the message got through, but the conversation wasn't there, right? It's like if somebody sends you an email and you correct what they asked for, but you don't reply back, like that. So yeah, I became fascinated with the ins and outs. And I think one of the reasons that I never could say, this is my tradition and this is the view that I will stick to for my life, and what this tradition says is real is what's real, is because for me, it was all real right from the start. So for me to say, yes, this is the true thing, I adhere to it and its scriptures, and that's what's real, would be like me saying, I adhere to, Northern Italian cuisine, and I will never have anything else because everything else is not real. So that's where my, sort of, I was presented with eclectic choices right from the start, which obviously as the internet became a thing, only became, more and more prevalent.
You were mentioning there a book that you had in the 80s, and I think Poke Runyon.
Yeah, no, it wasn't that good. I had, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's like the complete book of witchcraft and magic. It's here somewhere. And for a complete book, it was like really thin, but it had a section on conjuring spirits, most of which was taken right from the Grimoire Verum, which I know now, I didn't know then. But there was enough to be workable, right? So I then later worked through Don Michael Craig's 11 Lessons in the High Modern Magic. That was it. Paul Hewson's Mastering Witchcraft, and then later hooked up with the OTO and got into Crowley for a little bit. And, yeah. But yeah, Poke I would have killed to have material from Poke Runyon back then, but I had what I had.
Knowing what you know now about magic and about various different religious and mystical traditions, how would you explain, or another way of putting it, do you have any insight as to what happened to you at 5 years old? Why it began to happen, what was happening to you, and why it stopped at 6 years old?
Yeah, so, I don't know if there was a trigger. My ego would love to say I'm a special person and that this just happened because of who I am. I suspect, though, that is not the case. I suspect that perhaps I hit my head or something, or maybe somebody hit me or something like that, because, like I said, rough and tumble. And so it might very well have been a physical trauma. I just don't remember. But, I once got hit by a car while riding a bicycle, and I don't remember that either. So, but whatever the trigger was, I think what happened is that, for lack of a better word, I shifted away from being oriented to the physical into being oriented to the astral, right? And so got a little view, maybe even a view of a different dimension of space, where I don't know enough about mathematics to really talk about four-dimensional space. But I would say that my brain shifted a little bit at that point, and that this could happen to a lot of people. And knowing what I know now about how reality is constructed, how samsara exists, how we don't know anything other than through our own minds, I almost wonder why it doesn't happen more often. And I think it probably does happen more often to more people than we know. It's just that they dismiss it, as a weird thing. My dad, for instance, is a very straight-laced guy. But as I got further into it, he would talk about, I remember when this happened, and there was this, I was at a bar, and I knew everything that everyone was saying about 10 seconds before they said it. It was like deja vu for half an hour. And then I slipped back. Or another time that as I got into it, my mom went a little new age for a while and dragged him along to something, and she came back like pissed because whatever exercise they did at the store, my dad had visions, and my mom didn't get anything. So I think it happens to people more. There is more to reality than we, want to acknowledge, but we don't talk about it a lot because you get looked at weird. And what's funny though is now that this is my job, and like I said, I'm a pretty boring person, so I'm just a dad, and I don't lie about what I do. I don't try to sugarcoat it. So when I'm at like a school function or something, I'm an author. I write books on magic, witchcraft, occultism. And it's actually, I'm shocked at how few people find it weird and how many people will kind of say, yeah, I want to check that out. And then they'll confide in me an experience they had or a practice they did or something like that. So it's pretty widespread.
You're talking here about this success that you had early on in your magical operations. And of course, you have many, many students. You have pioneered in many ways certain kind of magic courses online. You've been an early adopter of that. And your courses are very well known and well regarded. So you've had many students, and for a long time too. So you've seen presumably different levels of, as problematic as the word is, success, results, however you want to put it, presumably in your student body. So when you compare them to yourself, or include yourself in that whole mix, what do you think are the factors? Have you identified or observed any factors that determine or influence the success? Are some people just talented, just like some people are talented in movement, or the talented intellectually, for example? Or some people just kind of have it, or are there lifestyle things? What are the factors? I'm curious very much if you could also include yourself. Seems you had a sort of natural talent for it, as well as that youthful passion, and that carries one into such endeavors. When you compare yourself to your student body, have you observed anything?
Yeah. So, the youth is really kind of a key for me because it all became real for me before people could drum it into my head that it was not real. Right. So by the time I was a teenager and people were like, this is real, right? This isn't real, right? This is bullshit. Intelligent people don't believe in this. I could look at them and be like, you're not real. This is real. So for me, the youth was a big part of it. I think there are in fact talented people that can be talented in different ways. And then there's also everyone has challenges. So it's about meeting those challenges. So I often talk to people who will say, I can't visualize. And there are, of course, people with aphantasia who really do not visualize. But then there are people who get upset because they're not getting visited by spirits, or they're not seeing things in the way that others are saying that they're seeing things, in the way in which I sometimes will say that they're seeing things. And so it's easy to say they're not talented and people who see things are talented. But what I noticed over time, and having the opportunity to interface with hundreds and hundreds of people, is that a lot of times those people who don't see anything will be very successful in what they want as far as spell work. So they'll do spells to get whatever it is that they're working on, and that'll manifest for them. Or they'll use magic to help them along with something that they're trying to do personally. And it will work for them, and they will become stronger, wiser, better in any discernible way. And so for me, who I close my eyes and there's a good chance I'm going to see things, right? If I attend the open circle, if somebody could make something up entirely, lead me on a path working, I'm going to see something. But what I came around to is that's not necessarily a good thing. That's not necessarily better than the people who don't see much. In fact, it can be worse because it's all low-level gobbledygook, right? You have to develop discernment. You have to cut through that. It's like dreams, right? We all have dreams every night. They're usually just short-term memories being translated into long-term memories, so they don't mean much. We have to cut through that if we want to have a meaningful dream. It's the same thing. If you just settle, well, I said a prayer and now I feel something. Okay, but is it speaking meaningfully? Is it giving you actionable things? Is it really what you're reaching out to, or should you reach out further or try to get a clearer connection? And that's at the point that the talent, one way or the other, starts to become irrelevant. Talent will only get you so far. After that, it becomes practice and engagement. Now, are there some people who, no matter how hard they practice, maybe they won't get anything? I think there probably are. That's the reality. And for as well regarded as my classes are, I will occasionally, not often, thankfully, but occasionally get somebody who's like, look, I gave this a real shot. I'm not getting much out of it. To which I will say, okay, I understand. And I'm not going to look at you and say, well, you didn't work hard enough or anything like that. Like, because I've done practices that other people have found value in and just been like, this was not for me at any rate. So I think in the end, though, for most people, there is some amount of ability, of capacity, just because we're human beings. Think about just plain old meditation, shamatha meditation, right? People say I'm good at it. People say I'm bad at it. People that say they're good at it, are they really good at it? Or did they just cut through the very surface level of thoughts to the point that they're now sitting there going, yeah, I am so clear. I am just not thinking at all. Good for you, Jason. I'm so clear. Not even grasping that those are thoughts that, you're no longer really focused. And then other people who will sit, they'll get distracted, they'll refocus, they'll get distracted, they'll refocus, they'll get distracted, they'll refocus. And they'll say, oh my God, I'm terrible at this. I keep getting distracted and I need to refocus. When in fact, both of those people are having the same exact experience. They're just interpreting it differently. One of them is frustrated at how much they're getting distracted because they thought they would sit down, the clouds would open, light would shine down, and all would be clear. And the other person really thinks that the light is shining down and all is clear when it's not. But both of them, if they just stick with it, will find that it's not something they can really fail at. That maybe there will be some talent that pulls them over a hurdle, but that same talent becomes an obstacle later on. I think, schools are filled with talented and gifted programs filled with the kids that as adults are like, yeah, it turned out it wasn't that easy. My talent only got me so far. So I wish I could say I've identified it all, but I think for most people, if they keep at it and work at it, they'll get somewhere.
Yeah, I think one of the barriers to I think for shamatha, one of the things is just getting around to actually doing it. I don't mean sitting and practicing. I mean whilst on the mat.
Yeah,
I've noticed for myself anyway. Very often, my practice is discovering how much else I was doing than the actual thing, and how simple that technique is, and it's powerful because of its simplicity, and how difficult it is to reduce oneself to that simplicity. So much else going on. But so I think in some ways, if I reflect on my own shamatha practice, for instance, it's in terms of shamatha, it hasn't gone very far at all. But in terms of recognizing what my mind is doing, actually some some progress there. And it's odd. It's almost as if the shamatha for myself is often, I feel, rather a standstill. But then so much around it is beneficial that I almost embrace that sort of inverse progress.
I know exactly what you mean, and I think that in this day in particular, in the world that we now live in, especially post 2007, it's important for people to integrate idle time. That if you're going to have a meditation practice or a contemplation practice, that you also have an idle time practice where you really aren't doing anything, including focusing on your breath or whatever it is. So, and the reason for that is we no longer have boredom, right? We've just kind of taken all idle time out of life. It was already being chipped away at with TV and radio and constant things. And then in 2007, the invention of smartphones. Now we don't even stand online and get bored. We get in line for a coffee, and if there's more than a minute or two, checking the email. No one is ever bored. No one has any time. And we can also fill our lives with spiritual practices in the same way. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to say this mantra, and then I'm going to focus on this, and then I'm going to... Without any idle time, no connections are made, right? And so shamatha, if we don't have that idle time elsewhere, becomes a release valve where, yeah, we can't just focus on the breath or experience clarity, because the moment we slow down enough to do that, our brain is now like, oh, thank God, let me make these connections. And so I don't know, like during those moments, do you get like, let me grab a notebook because all of a sudden I have ideas that I don't normally have. And so I honestly think people that have cushion time should also have scheduled idle time where they just walk around and do nothing. Or, I think Gurdjieff was big into this. He would give people at the Priory repetitive tasks like, breaking apart rocks or digging a ditch or something like that. Maybe he needed a ditch dug at the... So, killed two birds with one stone, wax on, wax off. But at the same time, he's so right that give the mind time to be idle, to make connections. Yeah, so I think it's important for those of us that aren't full-time contemplatives. And honestly, it's probably important for them. I've talked to a couple monks in Nepal that were actually jealous of Western visitors, and they're like, I don't have time to meditate. Like, I've got sadhanas to chant, chores to do. I do not have, like, I can't just go sit in my room and meditate on Hivadra for 8 hours a day. That's not what being a monk is. So do you ever, like, when you sit down and you have those moments where it's maybe you're not making headway in shamatha, but you're making headway as a person, like you're making headway in your mind? Like, do you ever get the urge, like, is that when ideas come to you?
Yes, I see what you mean. Well, sometimes. I think more what I mean is when I reflect on, say, my shamatha practice, the thing that I think to myself, gosh, I'm really glad. The precious thing, if you like, is not necessarily the progress in shamatha itself, such as it is, or such as it isn't in my case, but it's the recognition of the degrees of dissipation that I was unaware of.
Yeah.
That kind of like sobering up to degrees of dissipation is, I think, just a great, not to be too hyperbolic about it, a great treasure, actually.
It is.
Because that, once you've seen that, once you've noticed that again and again, you start to think, oh my goodness. And then all of life becomes slightly more lucid.
Yes.
When you catch on to those dissipations, those unconscious, when they become conscious dissipations, you think, you get so much, I think, from that. I found anyway. As for, maybe that is shamatha. Anyway, enough about my extremely amateur shamatha practice. So, another aspect that I've noticed seems to influence people's experience of any kind of practice, religious, spiritual, contemplative, or otherwise, anything really, is the why, the motivation for getting into it. That can often have a great effect not only on success or failure, relative success or failure, but also on just one sort of experience moving through the learning process and the practice process and the application process. Given you've had so many students come through your courses, have you observed categories of why? Why is it that people come to your courses? Why do they come to magick? Are there different types that you've noticed? Or is it really as diverse as every single person's motivation is somehow especially different?
Well, I think I'm a big believer in the individual. So I think everyone's motivation is a little different, but certainly there are categories. There are people who get into it because, well, they want to get laid and paid. They want to do the magic for for completely hedonistic reasons. And I'll usually tell people, if that's the only motivation, there are actually more sure and better ways to do that. Like you should go and become a hedge fund manager and take a class in picking up people or whatever it is you do. So there is that. Then there are the people that are just moved by spirit and moved by magic in the way that I am, that they feel it's there and it's a calling, and maybe they even tried to ignore it, but they won't let it go. And then there are also people who are in it because it's popular, right? It became a thing. It became a way to be counterculture for a while. And I think whatever people's initial motivation is, for me, is less important than what keeps them going. And I can't remember the name right now of the Mahasiddha who was originally a bandit, and he went to go rob a guru, and I forget exactly what happened, but the guru, he wanted to know then, well, if you're a great Mahasiddha, tell me how I can turn invisible so that I can be like the greatest bandit.
The Maha Bandit.
The Maha Bandit, right. So he's like, sure, go ahead. You circle this stupa 100,000 times, say this mantra. When you're done, a snake will appear and a sword will appear in your hand. Chop the head off the snake and you'll learn how to become invisible. And so he did. And everything happened exactly as the guru said. But he also attained enlightenment in the process, even though he was really kind of going for the banditry. At the end of it, he didn't want to be a bandit anymore. He realized, that there was so much more. And so he became the Mahasiddha, whose name I can't remember. But I try to keep that in mind, because if I get somebody who joined it because it's very popular, right? I might be tempted to think, you don't feel that call, you just wanted to, but you never know what that person is going to wind up as a year, 5 years, 10 years down the line. Because I know I didn't realize where I would end up a year, 5 years, 10 years down the line from where I started. So I don't think too much about people's initial motivation. But I do notice it for sure. And there are some people who they get in and maybe they have utterly unrealistic expectations. They for whatever reason believe in like Harry Potter magic, and they think that like if they do a spell to heal COVID in New York City, that next week there should be no COVID in New York City, to give an example. And so those are the folks where I kind of have to be like, it doesn't work that way. That's not how it works. And if that's what you want, this ain't that. So, here's your money back. And I don't want to misrepresent what we do. But for the most part, I think people feel the call to be spiritual. And some people, they are disenchanted with the religion of their birth, and they start exploring and they get moved. They hear about something that is working for someone else and they give it a try, and that's kind of what I did myself. It's an honest inquiry.
Well, I think we might be coming towards the end of our time. This has been so fascinating. I must petition you for a sequel. We haven't, I'll be honest with you, scratched the surface of what I'd hoped to ask you about, although it's been so interesting and fascinating in an unexpected way. So thank you very much. I must petition you for a sequel.
Anytime. You tell me when and I'll be here.
Great. May I ask one last question? Perhaps it's a little bit of a teaser question, just to open another thread. You mentioned there people casting spells against COVID and that sort of thing. And, I immediately thought of Wiccans against Trump, whatever it was. I remember at the time Trump was elected, I guess, 2016.
Yep.
And there were sort of circles of occultists, actual circles as well, would gather in a circle and, kind of curse him and this sort of thing. you have written about magical protection, psychic self-defense, to coin Dion Fortune's term there. You've written a classic book on it, actually. And that's something certainly I'd like to ask you about. So, praying against COVID, you're saying that's Harry Potter magic. What about Wiccans against Trump? How does that fit in? In other words, can you say something a little bit about, can you edge into curses and that kind of offensive magic? How does it work? What's a realistic way of looking at that? What about the Wiccans against Trump?
Sure.
What happened there?
So, I have this year, if I have a theme, it's been a saying that I've been using again and again, which is magic is real and it works like other real things, right? And I keep saying it because people who think magic is real keep acting like it doesn't work like other real things. So when we think about let's end COVID in New York City, or let's, I want to do a spell for peace in the Middle East right now. Does it work? Well, it has an impact, just not enough to be felt. Like if you and I jump up and down right now, I think we're to some minuscule degree affecting the rotation of the earth, just not enough for anyone to notice or care. But we're still, we're doing, our effort is having an effect. If I try to push a Toyota Tundra up a hill, it's not going to happen. It doesn't mean that I'm not real. It's just the effort isn't there. So you need to find, now, if you're doing magic to get the Rafah Pass open to alleviate, some of the crisis in the Middle East, now you've got a better shot. If you know the names of the people who are making that decision and those who are lobbying them, now you've got an even better shot, right? So it all becomes, what are the things that we can enchant and influence? So now turn to Wiccans against Trump, or occultists against Trump, and whatnot. Trump is just one guy, right? So we don't have the same problem. It's not peace in the Middle East. It's one dude. So why is he still walking around? And in fact, why is he so vigorous? I'm not going to make any secret. I don't like Trump. I'm not I would absolutely, not, I don't ever want to see a Trump presidency again. I didn't want to see it the first time. I'm traumatized in so many ways by it. So, but why then didn't the Wiccans or the occultists or anyone else that was doing magic against him work? Well, there's a few reasons. One, not really great links. And when someone is very, very widely known, there's a lot of attention on them, which means there's a lot of influence. So your magic is only going to have so much influence. The other thing is people are discounting the protection magic that he has going, right? And I'm not even talking about occultists doing magic. I'm talking about, let's say there's 1,000 witches of various stripes doing magic to jinx him in one capacity or another. Well, there are probably 3 million Christians praying for his safety. And when you start to kind of peek into that world, they don't call it magic, but they understand the principles. They understand that even if, you know, all of those people are not adepts of any kind or particularly holy people, when there's 3 million of them, there's a lot of power there, right? If 3 million people storm a fort or a base or an embassy, they're getting in. None of them have to be particularly, you know, like Navy SEALs. There's 3 million of them. And so he has this going for him. It's just simple. It is protection magic. And it's a lot to overcome. That said, did things get through? I think things did, maybe. He certainly was not problem free. He certainly was not, you know, he certainly had his fair share of difficulties, and he lost the 2020 election. So I think that there were people doing some things that work, but again, what are the obstacles? What are you pushing against? And what's pushing against you? So that's really the deal with Trump. And it's the deal with all magic of any kind, curses or not. What are you pushing up against? What are you trying to influence? Right?
Is it easier, would you say, from a magical point of view, to oppose, say, a political figure that you dislike, or to, I suppose, take a leaf out of the Christian's book and pray for that figure, in fact, and perhaps through that positive support, assuming one considers oneself to be in the right, which I think is probably a prerequisite to curse somebody, from that same starting place, could one pray for somebody and hope through that act to introduce what you consider to be, presumably, are assured of, is positive influence, namely yours? Is that an easier way than going head to head with somebody? Or is it not really the way to think about it?
It's not easier. I would say it's almost never easier to do positive magic. I always, in the 80s during the Satanic Panic, a lot of occult publishers were trying to really kind of whitewash witchcraft and say, you know, no real witch would ever do magic, and if a curse, and if anyone ever, you know, to do a curse, one would have to be so advanced that you wouldn't want to do a curse, and it's simply not the case. Think about a knife, right? It takes a certain amount of skill to dice an onion well. It takes a lot of skill to perform a tracheotomy with the knife. It takes almost no skill to put the pointy end in somebody's, you know, or slit somebody's throat. It's forced. Now, obviously, you can train and be better at it and nuance. So, but it's not easier to be positive. It's not more effective to be positive. It really is a matter of where's the tipping point? Where is the lever? What can you actually tip? Right? So if you're trying to sway a national election in America, where are the counties? Like, never mind, like, where are the swing states? What counties actually are the, like, you know, this city's going to vote Democrat, you know, this area is going to vote Republican. You would need to do something incredibly miraculous to sway that. But there's always a couple counties that can tilt it one way or another. That's why they're swing states. So now you've got something that you can push. And then how are you pushing it? Are you just sitting at home doing mantras, right? Like I can sit and do Vajrakalaya mantras to overcome the obstacles facing my candidate, or, you know, stabby with the perb of the bad guy. But if you can go there, or you know people, you can send something there to actually be in that place, then there's a tangible anchor to that, right? I think in one of your podcasts, John Reynolds talked about the statues that Pabonkapa had taken down, which compromised the magical security of Tibet. The reason that there were statues is that, like, that physicality matters. Anchoring from the astral to the etheric to the physical, it matters. So that's sort of where the real magic comes in. That's why in root work they're using powders and you know, and oils and so on and so forth, and going to great lengths to get links to targets. They're not just sitting there wishing that something would happen. Now, if you get 3 million people to wish something would happen, then, you know, that might be enough to overcome those links or that lack of specificity. But it's hard to get 3 million people to do something.
How would you advise let's say, this is hypothetical, I suppose, or maybe not. How would you advise a political candidate in, let's just say, protection magic? Let's limit it to that, unless you'd like to extend it. But at least in protection magic, it seems that no matter what you stand for, what position you take, there's some group somewhere across some aisle or another that's going to hold a different position and will consider your position to be wrong or the enemy and so on. So there's always going to be opposition. There's always going to be strongly held emotion, belief, identity, all these sorts of powerful group thought, the potency of that, group belonging, and so on. So when you step into that kind of a race, you step into that kind of a sphere, you're playing in those fields, whether you like it or not. Call it what you want. Call it magic, call it, group psychology, whatever. So how would you advise a political candidate who, presumably in top secret, would come to you in terms of protection magic?
Oh, good question. I've never been asked that one before. So the first thing I would do is I would tell them to get someone they trust. And if they came to me, I would, for a political candidate, I would probably do one-on-one work. But get someone to make them an amulet, a talisman, something that they can keep on their person. It doesn't have to be seen. And then another amulet for their home, for where they are, right? And the reason I say that is because their job is to be a political candidate, not a wizard. So telling them to do banishing rituals, a daily or things like that, that's for the practitioner to do, right? Now, if they then want to hire someone to kind of constantly be working on their behalf, that would be even better. And so if somebody is coming to a sorcerer saying, I'm worried about psychic protection, then they might be the kind of person who can divert some money and hire somebody, usually out of a personal budget. This is not unheard of, by the way. It happens. I know of it happening in business, in the corporate world, quite a bit. I know a couple people that have done it politically, always under the table. And then I know of examples in Russia and a few more in the Middle East that, you know, do this kind of thing, and they have their Rasputin, for lack of a better word. You know, they have their John D. But it all has to be much more hush hush now, because that would be fodder for what a crackpot they are. But yeah, I would tell them to quietly hire someone on the side, you know, maybe through an intermediary, to do work for them, to keep, you know, set them up. If they trusted that person, you would want to have personal links, so that person would have, you know, a lock of hair or something, or, you know, a little vial of blood or something from the person that they want to protect. But then that's a lot of trust you're placing in that person. But that's what I would recommend. Get someone else to do it, because you're not, you know, you're not a professional. Just like you hire a bodyguard, hire a psychic bodyguard, and then decide on the degree. Have them make an amulet for your person and your home. If you feel if that person felt comfortable having themselves cleansed and their home or office cleansed, then that would be ideal as well. So that would be it, though. I would definitely recommend not spending too much time or effort on it. If they wanted to spend a lot of time or effort on it, hire somebody that knows what they're doing to spend that time and effort, and get about the work of governing. Gosh darn it.
And what would the practitioner be doing to expect? What would a practitioner be thinking? Okay, I have this political candidate now has come to me in secret, and you know, maybe I have a clipping of their toenail, or, you know,
Yeah,
or something like that. What's the practitioner going to be thinking? Okay, here's what I'm going to have to put into place here.
right. So
We've done the amulet.
First of all, if they had a client that was receiving a consistent level of barrage like that, the first thing I would want to do is have some place that is not my house to do the work in. It could be on the property, but a shed outside, you know, some place that is not where you're sleeping, to do the work. And then it becomes a matter of, I would set up some kind of witch bottle. I would put plants around that area, watch the plants. If the plants start to die, if the witch bottle shatters, then there might be something that you need to do more than what you do every day. But certainly if you're, I would be actively doing a protection practice for that person, praying to the, you know, to the Gorgons to turn anyone to stone that wants to attack them, or whatever the practice is. You know, if a Simhamuka practice, a dokpa every day to turn away negativity, so that you're doing that every day, and at the same time you're watching for something that is even stronger, right? Because magical security isn't really that much different than regular security in that case. You have an embassy or a building, it's got guards, it's got a fence, but they're not. But when they're know that they're going to be under attack, there's 4 times the amount of guards. The security protocols become like, it takes a half an hour to get in and out of the place, and you know, there's maybe concrete barriers in addition to the fence. So magical protection, then if something happens, that's when, okay, well, now we want to conjure spirits, we want to do energy practices, we want to contact, you know, talk to the target. How are they experiencing any symptoms? I need to be doing more. Can we meet in person? Another cleansing. shielding, that kind of thing. So you respond to situations that arise, even if you have some level of protection. And here too is where that magic is real and works like other real things. There are people out there that think they are protected. They've got a Singamuga pendant that was blessed by a Rinpoche. They are now immune. That's not the case. It's not the case for anyone. There's no such thing as completely foolproof protection. That's not the world we live in. You take reasonable protection, and then if risks go up, you take greater protection. And it's just like that. So if those plants started dying, or if I would probably do divination regularly. And if divination started to show that something was coming, then you want to amp up the protection. It's hard with a political candidate, though, because they have to be seen. So you can't do too many things to just shield them, because that can also make people seem either hidden or distanced, hard to relate to. And that can be its own difficulty.
And you take it to the shed, why?
You take it to the shed.
At your front door.
Excuse me, sorry, that Alexa there. You take it to the shed because the muck that comes in that you're protecting against, even successfully, it's mucky. That itself can attract more negative entities. Also, if you find yourself dealing with very wrathful spirits for counter magic all the time, then it's best to do that off property, right? Because those kinds of wrathful spirits are surrounded by wrathful spirits, and they attract more wrathful spirits, right? Every now and then, if you need to do some heavy protection or heavy curse work or something like that, sure, you can do that in your house, and then you cleanse and you're done. But if you're doing it all the time, well, then that's what you're surrounding yourself with. I always tell people it's kind of like, if you needed to go to the mafia for a favor, you needed to go to Tony Soprano for a favor. You get the favor, you know what you're giving him in exchange, and it's done, right? But if you want to be Tony's friend and you want to hang out all the time, that's different. That now you're going to be surrounded by those people all the time, and sooner or later it's gonna cause problems. So it's like that.
This has been absolutely fascinating. I look forward to the sequel. Jason Miller, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.